Mind Matter Media presents Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast, where discussions center around the most current and innovative approaches to landscape conservation and design. This is the show for stakeholders who want to adapt to the climate crisis, halt biodiversity loss, and change the world by designing sustainable and resilient landscapes through collaborative conservation action.
Welcome to Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast. I'm your co-host, Rob Campoloni.
And I'm your other co-host, Tom Ewald. Hey, Rob, who do we have on the podcast today?
We have a really exciting episode ahead, Tom. A couple of weeks ago, we had Alex Wright, the coordinator of the Midwest Landscape Initiative, on the show. And I was really excited to talk to Alex because he's what I refer to as a second generation Fish and Wildlife Service landscape designer, if you will. And as expected, it was a great discussion, learning about his perspectives on designing sustainable landscapes, what that means, and how to do it within this collaborative framework with a diversity of partners. Well, today's guest, Dr. Amanda Sesser, is the coordinator of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, otherwise known as CCAS. And that's another broad-based conservation partnership effort that's going through a stakeholder-driven, science-based decision-making process to design sustainable landscapes. I'm excited to chat with Amanda in part because she's a first-generation Fish and Wildlife Service landscape designer from back in the day when you and I and a handful of others, including Amanda, were laying the foundation for landscape conservation design within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and more importantly, pushing it out into the landscape conservation cooperatives. Today's discussion really has the potential to be insightful, Tom, because I know both you and Amanda to be big, innovative thinkers on this topic, and I'm looking forward to seeing where the conversation goes.
No, those are good thoughts. You bring up looking at how things have evolved over, that time when we were working together there. And I'm thinking about how things have evolved over the years. It's a really interesting question. I mean, to me, it depends on how you ask it. If you add the word design at the end, then in my mind, you're talking about the planning aspect as it's envisioned in that concept. That restricts talking about the topic to the world of science and planning. The term conservation implies this focus on biodiversity in many ways, although, I think that the term can be a lot more broad. If you're talking about the means towards developing collaborative strategic plan, like design and planning, I'm sure that there's been many evolutions on the technological side of things, particularly in the developed world with data, information, and science to visualize landscapes and to help people design and plan. A broader conversation to expand the scope would be, let's look at the concept of landscapes without the conservation, without the design aspect of it. I would like to find, how do we make landscapes, this concept, more mainstream beyond the world of science and agencies and organizations? And to me, that's an evolution that needs to happen. I'm not so sure that we're there right now. And at the same time, I think that, the broader holistic thinking of landscapes at landscape scales is happening more and more. It's just not maybe in a structured realm like planners like to think about, where you have these steps of convening, planning, implementing, monitors. I know that there's counties in the U.S. that identify goals, look at plans, and develop a plan with spatially explicit activities. So, it kind of sounds to me like with landscapes and a design process centered around landscapes, we're kind of talking about another aspect, another layer almost of planning. And I think we need to be clear about what the ask is when we ask people to enter that world of talking about landscapes. What are we asking the world to do differently than that they're not doing already in some of the locally led landscape type efforts? Counties plan and watershed councils plan and people do some sort of planning. To me, the question across the podcast is always like a new governance structure, model that needs to be developed that incorporates or gets us out of silos to do something that is done by, some of the more official governance models like counties, that they're not doing everything from a landscape perspective, either in terms of concepts like connectivity or timeframes, where you're looking at landscape timeframes. But I see so much value in creating these collaborative efforts like CCAS that Amanda is working on, and that we're creating these structures at a broader scale that is somehow augmenting the existing ways that we do planning and design. To me, when we talk about landscapes, we're talking about an integration of myriad existing structures within a geographic area and asking them to think more holistically and longer term with some of those ideas like connectivity and transcending jurisdictional boundaries. I think there's a robust world of planners and designers out there at the local level, conservation districts, many counties have planners thinking about sustainability. It feels important to me to kind of clarify what we're asking people to do differently with this concept of landscapes and some of the concepts embedded within landscape conservation so that they can actually use and implement landscape conservation design.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's interesting. You use the terminology of planning quite a bit in your introduction, Tom. I think of it more as design. And there is a difference between the two disciplines. And what I like about the idea of design is that we're building something. The design discipline has been around for as long as humanity, and we've been designing things, all sorts of things, trinkets and phones. And I'm just looking at my desk here, pens and, microphones and computers. We design these things and then we build them. And I think in landscape conservation design, we're talking about building something new. A few episodes ago, we had a very thoughtful discussion about the international community's agreement on the 2022 Global Biodiversity Framework with Hugh Possingham, specifically as it relates to Target 3 of the agreement, which is that we're going to conserve and manage 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. And that's an international agreement. Nearly 200 countries signed on to it. And Joe Biden's administration has pushed that out. And partnerships like Amanda's are working together to try and figure out how to actually identify representative, well-connected landscapes, ecosystems within those landscapes that are governed sustainably. It's interesting that the conservation community has really rallied around this idea of 30 by 30, which is just target number 3 of this global biodiversity framework that includes 23 targets. And everyone is just kind of focusing in on target 3. I'm particularly interested in target 1, which speaks to the idea of a participatory, inclusive, spatial planning, and collaborative management approach, which sounds a whole hell of a lot like landscape conservation design to me, Tom. I want to talk to Amanda about what she's doing with her partners to address target 1 with ultimately probably a goal to target 3. But then there's those other 21 targets that we also need to speak to. And one of those is empowering disenfranchised communities, indigenous peoples, local communities, and empowering them in the spatial planning and decision-making process. And so I definitely want to talk to Amanda about that.
I think you partially answered my question from earlier. What are we asking for people to do differently? A landscape approach could potentially be one where you're not looking at target 1, 2, 3. It could be a way of integrating all those targets into one landscape-based, holistic way of looking at the world. I don't know what all the targets are, but maybe there's a way in that approach to do it more holistically and with sustainable development goals as well.
Let me share Amanda's bio so we could get this conversation started. Dr. Amanda Sesser has substantial experience building and leading landscape conservation partnerships among diverse state, federal, and NGO partners. She led multi-stakeholder landscape scale conservation planning and implementation efforts among over 30 partners from Alaska and Northwest Canada, including federal agencies, 4 states, indigenous communities, research institutions, and non-governmental organizations. Amanda also assisted with incorporating climate change into daily management practices while in Alaska. She brings experience from technical and collaborative leadership in dozens of states and 19 countries, where she has helped organizations, communities, and governments better understand, manage, and adapt to social and ecological changes. Amanda is currently located in New Orleans, Louisiana, and is the coordinator of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy Partnership, otherwise known as CCAS. CCAS brings together public and private organizations around a bold vision for the future of their region, connecting the lands and waters of the Southeast and Caribbean to support healthy ecosystems, thriving fish and wildlife populations, and vibrant communities. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Ecology and Conservation from Florida Institute of Technology, a Master's of Science in Ecosystem Ecology from Tulane University, and a PhD in Biology from the University of Alaska. Without further ado, let me welcome my old colleague and friend, Dr. Amanda Sesser, to the show. We're really glad to have you here, Amanda. Did I miss anything from your bio that you want to add or highlight?
Hi, Rob and Tom. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. And no, I think you did a great job with the introduction. Thank you.
Hey, before we begin, I threw around the S word quite a bit in my introduction, and I want to give you a chance to speak to the idea of sustainability from your perspective. I raise the subject because if we're going to discuss landscape conservation design as a method and a means to achieve 30 by 30, and in my mind, that includes the idea of designing sustainable landscapes, I think it's important for our listeners to understand what we're talking about when we use the word sustainability.
I was glad to hear the conversation that you and Tom were having at the beginning of the episode around what design means and what conservation means. And it's really relevant when it comes to landscape sustainability. When I think of landscape sustainability, it's so much broader than just the conservation institution. A well-designed landscape needs to meet all of the needs of society: transportation, housing, energy, minerals, and other extracted resources, as well as vibrant communities, parks, recreation access, and then all of the conservation values of fish, wildlife, habitat, biodiversity. A well-designed landscape needs to meet all of those values. And so for me, sustainability is when you have a landscape that can meet all of the values of society without drastically altering its state towards one value or another, meaning all of the values can be designed for and managed for in a way that they can all coexist. And what we see a lot in the conversation around landscape conservation design, it's a fantastic first step to have the conservation institution of an entire ecoregion coming together under one vision, thinking of how are we going to combine forces to tackle some of these wicked 21st century challenges that no one organization or institution can handle alone, like climate change, climate adaptation. But when we are speaking with one voice, we can now enter into conversations with these other sectors and have a seat at the table. Individually, the conservation institution is much too small to be at the table with the transportation sector, the energy, the education, housing, all the other sectors that are driving the market economy that is driving the future of our landscapes. So for me, sustainability is when all of those values, including conservation, but not limited to conservation, have a space at the table.
When you talk about sustainability at the landscape scale, so it sounds like you are considering engaging with some of the direct threats on the landscape. You don't want to articulate that as threats to some of the sustainability factors, but in some way you have to kind of frame it as that in a way. So what are some ways that you have found that you can effectively convene these diverse interests around some of those things that might be perceived as direct threats, but in a truly holistic landscape, we need to kind of not use that language, but that concept still is kind of embedded in there.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom. What I always say is that one person's threat is another person's livelihood. So I don't use that term at all in a partnership space. Drivers of change can fit, but if you're in Alaska, for instance, and you're working with the mining community, the people who are mining have moved out into the landscape because they value the wide open wilderness. They value the vastness, the naturalness of the Alaska landscape. And so they share many of the same values that the conservation community does. Here in the Southeast, private landowners really care about keeping their working lands working. They care about the biodiversity. They care about the endangered species. And so they might be in the timber harvesting industry or paper pulp or any of the other industries, but they still really care and they want to keep their lands working because the alternative would be, to sell to a developer and then have condos or a shopping mall or something go in that place. And so at our core, we have many shared values. And that's the way that we connect as people, right? Across any kind of space is we connect with values, we connect with shared experiences, and trying not to alienate one sector or another. As a person who has a vehicle and lives in a home and uses electricity, I would be hypocritical to say that the transportation sector is not important in my life. I mean, if I-95 has a pileup and I can't get where I'm going for hours at a time, like that really affects me, right? And I use electricity, I use resources, I use the Douglas fir studs in my house were harvested in the Pacific Northwest, where you are, Tom, and we have this interdependence in our society on petroleum resources and solar and wind and other sources of energy. We have an interconnected web that is the foundation for our society. So to think about it only in terms of the conservation institution really sells ourselves short in terms of reaching sustainability. If you think about what shapes and drives a landscape, it's all the other sectors that I mentioned earlier, transportation, energy, housing, that are not in a designed way typically, but just going out and making those changes across the landscape, deciding where new roads are going to be built, where new housing complexes are going to be built, and where and how much we're going to be putting in power plants and other things. And the conservation community is very typically not at the table when making those decisions. And so landscape design is an effort to say, okay, how can we grab the pen and write that future that allows for all of those sectors and all of the things that our society needs to exist in a way that can be maintained long term and in a way that's sustainable.
In regards to the question of how do you bring diverse set of stakeholders together to have this conversation about sustainability, is that the common thread amongst all of us, all the different sectors, is human health and well-being. And every sector of society believes that it is contributing to well-being in different ways, of course, that all have different impacts on the environment and on biodiversity. But nevertheless, our society, our way of living has come a long way. And that's because organizations have developed processes. Some of those processes are planning and design processes to create things that make life easier. And in theory, if you could afford it, better. Within the context of landscape conservation design, landscape conservation, I think about scientific disciplines that have contributed to the evolution of our way of thinking about conservation in general. In the late 70s, early 80s, we had, landscape ecology, studying the relationship of landscape patterns and their influence on biological and ecological processes. Then you had, conservation biologist Michael Soule and Reed Noss come into the picture in the early 80s and and say, hey, we have a real problem here with the number and diversity of threatened and endangered species. And we as a conservation community, we as biologists need to address this and to specifically speak to or take action to conserve the most vulnerable biological aspects of the landscape. And designing that interconnected landscape makes a lot of sense on the conservation side of the house. But how do you do that without impacting the social side of the house? And this idea of landscape sustainability and landscape sustainability science that kind of has embraced the idea of human well-being might be the avenue where we kind of sort out both the ecological side of the house, but also the social side of the house.
When you're talking about this biodiversity loss and this loss of connectivity, we know the pattern of land use change in this country, but across the globe, is one of ecosystem fragmentation and habitat degradation. And we are well versed in conservation science in trying to pick up the pieces, right? So conservation science was developed to be very reactive, to wait until something breaks and then come in and try to fix it back to what it used to be, or restore ecosystem services, or whatever the goal is. And in the Southeast, as well as in the other landscape partnerships that I've coordinated, we need to change the conversation away from how do we let the larger market economy come through and continue to fragment, right? How do we prevent that from happening? And where we just let it come, we just let the bulldozer roll through, and then we, as the conservation institution, pick up the pieces. We need to change it from that to one of how can we design where are the most important wildlife corridors and connectivity across the landscape so that species can track their climate niches as the climate changes, and that we can protect hotspots of biodiversity and manage for threatened and endangered species, and all of the things that we do in a way that's proactive versus reactive. And by doing landscape design, we can think about, okay, it's not us versus them. And I said landscape design, not landscape conservation design, like I said in the beginning, because it's not us versus them. Landscape conservation design is a great step, but it's still us as the conservation institution versus everyone else. Landscape design takes us to that holistic view of, hey, these things really do matter to people and to people's livelihoods and people's quality of life. And so we do need to allow for certain values to be maintained on the landscape that are in contradiction to conservation values. But can we do it in a way where the environmental impacts are minimized? In other words, can we plan proactively for connectivity and say, hey, if you need to put in a transportation corridor that parallels I-95 to relieve traffic congestion, let's look at how you would place that on the landscape, where you would put it so that it's not going to disrupt panther migration pathways and other types of aquatic and terrestrial connectivity. Can we do it in a way where really sensitive and rare ecosystem types aren't going to be bulldozed over? Working with solar siting projects, for instance, to say, hey, here's a spot, here's the best spot for that, versus just what's the cheapest land or the easiest to get to, which is what some of the decisions that are being made now. So that idea of being proactive is really key to what we're talking about. And then from the partnership standpoint, we're not looking for shared objectives necessarily at that landscape level. We're looking for compatible objectives. That's something that Gordon Myers, who just took over a landscape coordinating role with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies earlier this month, he pointed that out to me at the last SECA steering committee meeting. We were having this conversation about compatible versus shared. And a compatible objective would say, okay, well, we might be doing this for different reasons, but it's going to help us get to the outcome that both of us want. So one group might be really thinking about access to affordable housing. And another group might be thinking about wildlife connectivity. But if they're compatible, it means, yes, we're working together to both achieve our individual outcomes, even if they're not the same thing, but driven by the same reason. And then lastly, the last point I'll make here before tossing it back to hear what you all think is we have to talk about the NIMBY phenomenon, NIMBY, or not in my backyard. We have to be open and honest about the history of placing energy projects, for example, in the backyards of communities of color and on tribal reservations. When we think about where we're going to place transportation corridors or a solar energy siting project, we really need to look in ourselves in the mirror. Sometimes the voices who are not represented at the table do not have the chance to speak, right? And so it's the NIMBY phenomenon means, yeah, I would love for this solar energy project to go forward. Just don't put it in my backyard. Don't put it near my community. But hey, you can put it towards that other community over there that's different than me. And guess what? They're not at the table, so they're not going to have anything to say about it. So we can just get it on the books, right? And we do have a legacy of doing that in our country as well as other places around the world. But when if we are going to do this sustainably, we need to think about breaking some of those patterns, those historic patterns of inequity and injustice, and making sure that underrepresented groups are at the table. You know, in the past, it was, oh, well, it's better for the entire landscape, even if it's bad for this community, right? It's like kind of take one for the team. But that way of doing business and making decisions, it's over, right? And we need to really think about what does that look like to be more inclusive. And we're doing so in a way that is better for all of humanity and not just the typical conservation partners that we usually work with.
What if we could rescue the planet from the ravages of the climate crisis and, in the process, save 1 million species from extinction? Would we do it? Former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Senior Policy Advisor for the National Wildlife Refuge System, Robert Campoloni, explores the United States' most pressing conservation challenge since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the triple planetary crisis: pollution, climate boiling, and biodiversity loss. In Designing Nature's Half, a practical guide to conserve 50% by 2050, Campoloni reveals previous nationwide initiatives to design sustainable and resilient landscapes, provides an easy-to-follow how-to guide for taking a collaborative, science-based approach to identify conservation actions across large landscapes, and advocates for taking a third nationwide try to design nature's half. Learn how to take a synergistic approach to mitigating the climate crisis and conserving biodiversity in Designing Nature's Half, a practical guide to conserve 50% by 2050 and be part of the global movement to save the planet. For more information, visit www.designingnatureshalf.com.
That was a great answer to my initial question that I was asking. You know, what are we asking people to do differently? And so we're asking people to get together, look at what we have in common, look at some of those injustices, look at some of those ways that things can be done better in terms of where we spatially put, important parts of how people make a living. So, my question then is, what are some of the modalities to get towards that outcome that we're looking for? Is it that county planners are incorporating this information into their strategic plan? That's where a lot of things happen at a local level. There's all sorts of local level governance bodies that do planning. How does that information that we develop in a landscape design get to the ground so that people can use it to make decisions, to have those conversations? Or does that happen at the level of the collaborative landscape partnership that might be developed? I'm just trying to get your sense of your kind of theory of change, I guess, about how that works.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. I mean, that's the $65 million question, really, is getting down to the implementation piece. And there are as many models out there as there are groups that are working on these types of challenges. So there's no silver bullet or one way to do it. But, I'm really inspired by community planners and county level practitioners. And if anyone has ever thought about going to the National Adaptation Forum but hesitated, I'm going to say, please go. It is pretty much the only conference that I like to go to these days. And It's a forum where a lot of community planners, state level folks come together, tribal leadership shows up in force, and they talk amongst each other about how can we do this? How can we combine forces? How can we link? And a lot of those conversations are also being had at these landscape scales, these broad coalitions across really large regions. And so that communication needs to happen both ways. If you have a good landscape conservation design, like SECAS has the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, it's our map showing 50% of the highest priority areas for conservation across the entire Southeast and U.S. Caribbean. Our team, the SECAS staffers, love to sit down with local practitioners and say, well, where do you fall out within the blueprint? And how can you, the actions that you're taking on a local scale, how does that scale up across the Southeast? And so stepping down these large designs into implementable local plans is kind of the point, right? Because you're not going to implement action at the landscape scale, most likely. The action is going to take place in smaller, management units or smaller within municipal boundaries, things like that, within watersheds or areas of a land trust or other organizations. So stepping it down is a key step, but then also making sure that your landscape design is inclusive of the local needs, the local priorities, so that if somebody from a state scale or a watershed scale or a county scale or a municipal scale looks at the design, they should be able to see their priorities reflected. And if they don't, we need to go back and revise it. So the Southeast Conservation Blueprint gets revised on an annual timeframe, because we do reach out and work with individuals from across the entire Southeast to say, sometimes they say, like, look, that doesn't make sense. You're over prioritizing this and you're completely missing this other thing. And our staff love to hear that, because it's an opportunity to improve the blueprint to make it more reflective of what's really a priority on the ground. So it's that two-way communication that's critical. And also, when it comes to organizations or sectors of the population who have not traditionally been included in designs and these type of large scale planning, there's one thing to say, well, we need to invite them to the table. Clearly we do, right? But I think the critical first step is for us to join their tables, us meaning the conservation institution and us meaning large scale regional collaboratives. We need to join their tables. We need to meet them where they are and listen to what's important to their communities, listen to what's important to their livelihoods. What are their greatest challenges? What are their perceived obstacles? What are their opportunities? And how can we learn from their experiences to then integrate their needs better into what we're doing? And some examples are, in the panhandle of Florida, there are North Star communities that have come together and formed a coalition in the wake of Hurricane Michael. So Hurricane Michael just destroyed a lot of communities in the Florida panhandle, and they're still to this day recovering and picking up the pieces. Several communities have come together into, like, again, what I call, they're calling themselves North Star communities. And they are communities that are heirs property. So you have African American communities who can trace their land back in their families for generations upon generations. And you have folks who, might not have gone to college, yet they know how to manage their land like nobody's business, right? They can read their land like the back of their hand, and they really know what it is that they're doing. They were trying to put together a trail that would link the North Star communities to bring in some tourism and recreation economy. And the trail would then end up in a national forest area where people could then camp and everything for the weekend. But to get there, you'd walk through these communities, and there would be museums describing the experiences of the people who lived in these small communities and the history, and there could be libraries, and there could be ice cream shops and different businesses popping up along this trail. And so when the North Star Community Group decided that they, hey, let's get funding to build this trail, to build this cultural connectivity across the Florida Panhandle landscape, they were laughed out of the door. You don't have the science. You don't have enough data behind what you're talking about. This is science funding. And so the communities reached out to the SECA staffers, and the SECA staffers pulled up the Southeast Conservation Blueprint and said, all right, you know what? Let's talk about why this is important for biodiversity, for aquatic connectivity, for terrestrial connectivity, for all of these various resources, natural resources and cultural resources. Let's put some numbers on paper. And so they were able to pull out statistics of exactly why and how this project is going to be beneficial for the larger conservation community and help us reach that goal of a connected network of lands and waters. That's our vision. Our goal is a 10% improvement of the health function and connectivity of the southeastern landscape by 2060. They could pull statistics out and put it on paper and have a very solidified scientific justification for why this project makes sense. Next thing you know, the project's getting funded, and then it's going underway. And so it's that partnership. It's the listening to the communities, understanding what it is that they need, going to them, not asking them to come to us, and then finding that way where we can take that regional landscape scale design and scientific information and target it to on the ground outcomes in the local communities where people live.
Amanda, you talked a little bit about this NIMBY concept and suggested that the conservation community needs to come around with the idea that sometimes these big infrastructure projects are going to go in the landscapes that we care about, and we have to accept that. And I think that's right, but isn't that part of the negotiation process? So when you get to the point where there's a large infrastructure project going in or being proposed, and the collaborative is able to provide some perspective on that project, isn't the time to kind of have a discussion about implementing that project? Isn't it appropriate to do that at the tail end of that design process? Or are those decisions kind of being made separate from the design process?
A little bit of both. I would say that we don't want to wait until the end of the design process to think about who might be impacted by the design and to make sure that they're at the table to help direct how the design looks at the end. And the reason why NIMBY exists is because, first off, you can't have a table that's big enough that has everybody sitting at it. It's not going to function. So you have a cross section of the larger community sitting at a table to identify what's important and where we're going to put things. Large scale infrastructure projects will continue. Let's not fool ourselves. They will continue. But can we do it in a way that's smarter, has less ecological footprint, less impact, and does not contribute to our systems of hierarchy and oppression and injustice, right? So one of the ways that we can do that is by, okay, maybe there's some proposed sites for a large infrastructure project, and we want to say, all right, well, who would be impacted by that? And make sure that those people have a voice, because it's when they don't have a voice that project's going to be placed in their backyard. Because the people who do have a voice will say, great, we want the project to go forward, but just not right here, right? And so then there's a power dynamic where the people who are given a voice in the design project get to decide what goes where and what gets implemented where. And those folks who are not at the table, we're not even thinking about them because they're not even here. And that's what set up our current system of inequality. And I live here in New Orleans. I don't live very far from a place called Cancer Alley, a corridor through the river parishes and south of Baton Rouge called Cancer Alley for a reason, because there's been so much environmental pollution from the petroleum industry here in Louisiana that the rates of cancer are just very high. And so who lives in Cancer Alley? It is a majority Black area, and it is an area that struggles with poverty and access to some basic resources. And those folks aren't at the table when the decisions were made. They weren't at the table when the decisions were made to put a petrochemical plant right outside of their community, right next to the school. And so moving forward, clearly we need to move away from industry that is toxic to human health and think about nature-based solutions just in general. But we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's inclusive. And so it's always better to include impacted communities or marginalized voices from the very beginning than it is at the end. Well, if you've made it to the end and you're going to include people, well, that's better than not including them at all. But if you're really going to have a say and to be able to direct how the landscape design is going to look, it'd be better to have them involved from the very beginning. And they might have perspectives and ideas that no one's even considered before. And it can bring a new level of innovation to the project when you have a whole new sector of folks at the table.
And this is a concept that I've heard throughout our podcasts. And Amanda, you brought it up as well, this concept of a common table that people get together and talk and have dialogue and review information and come up with strategies. I think that's a common theme that we've heard throughout all the podcast episodes. So thank you for bringing that up. Rob, is there anything else you'd like to add?
People want to be participating in the decision-making process. And we could get into a discussion about the current political state of the country and the divisions that we're dealing with currently. But I think some of those divisions is precisely because people have felt disenfranchised and that decisions are being made without their participation. So I salute Amanda and her comments in regards to empowering people, local communities specifically. Tom and I were talking quite a bit about that for the book, and I think we're ready to make a recommendation as part of it. So I just wanted to comment on that, Tom, if there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, I thought this was a great discussion, and thanks, Amanda, for talking with us today.
Amanda, if you had any final thoughts.
Sure. Some of the tribes here in the Southeast have been helping me understand more this idea of reciprocity and how that translates to a regional collaborative like SECUS and doing the work that we do, across the entire Southeast. We often reach out to tribes asking for their indigenous knowledge, asking for their participation in various aspects of the landscape conservation design work that we do. And so often, we say thank you and then don't return to the tribe with here's the results and here's how your information was used, and just ensuring that indigenous knowledge is incorporated as well as Western science, how both, there's not just two, it's not a duality, but how all these different ways of knowing can lead to the data that would then support a regional design effort. And so this idea of reciprocity has been what I've been working with for the past year or so within the SECUS partnership. And one of the natural resources and cultural resources that's really important in the Southeast is giant river cane. It's habitat for a lot of threatened and endangered species, including Swainson's warbler and others. Cane breaks is another word for it. And they have been reduced to 10% of its historic range, right? Because cane breaks are also like a really good place to build houses and infrastructure. But for the tribes in the Southeast, many of them have already been displaced from their ancestral lands. And they might live in Oklahoma, but they're really interested in what's going on in Mississippi, in Louisiana, for instance. River cane is a cultural keystone species where it's used to make baskets and textiles and building material. It's used for instruments. It's used for tools and other really important aspects of society. And so it's a cultural keystone species for at least 16 tribes in the Southeast who've formed the River Cane Restoration Alliance. And so we're thinking about how do we bring in river cane as a cultural indicator into the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, right, from a scientific perspective, but we can't do that without indigenous knowledge. And at the same time, the people who have that knowledge are aging. And some tribes, there might only be one individual left who has that knowledge. And so the clock is ticking to get this information documented and share it with natural resource managers so that they can manage river cane breaks on national wildlife refuges, for instance, and other areas. But in a model of reciprocity, we need to set the table and invite our tribal partners to come eat. We're going to put the spread out. We're going to have the all-day buffet and then invite our tribal partners to come and eat. Maybe we'll do that 2 or 3 times and then ask our tribal partners if they can contribute their indigenous knowledge and put skin in the game of helping do restoration of giant river cane and so forth. But especially when we have had a long history within government, but also just the larger community of not being good partners, we have a lot of trust that we need to build. And we have to right a lot of the wrongs of the past. And that's going to take however long it takes before we get to the part where we feel like we have all of us at the table.
Well, thanks again to our guest, Dr. Amanda Sesser, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in to Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast. I've been your co-host, Rob Campoloni.
And I've been your other co-host, Tom Ewald. Join us every 2 weeks for another informative episode of Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast.
Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast, is researched, written, edited, and produced by Rob Campoloni and Tom Ewald. Lucas Gallardi created the Designing Nature's Half cover art and logo design. Tom Askin is the voice behind the intro and outro, and the music was written and performed by composer Alexei Kistelin via Pixabay. Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast, is a proud member of Mind Matter Media, a startup multimedia network whose mission is to change the world by designing sustainable and resilient landscapes for people, planet, and prosperity.